The cold pressure of the mall's concrete wall bit into my shoulder blades as Mark's hand clamped around my throat. I couldn't breathe. The air in the service corridor felt thick and stagnant, smelling of industrial cleaner and the expensive cologne I used to buy him when I still believed he loved me. My vision began to fray at the edges, the bright overhead fluorescent lights spinning into dizzying halos. I clawed at his wrist, my fingernails digging into his skin, but he only squeezed tighter, his face twisted into a mask of pure, possessive rage. "You think you can just leave?" he hissed, his breath hot against my ear. "You're mine, Hannah. You don't get to decide when this is over." I tried to scream, but the sound died in my constricted windpipe, turning into a pathetic, wet wheeze. The bustling sounds of the mall, the distant pop music, the laughter of teenagers, the clatter of the food court, felt miles away. I was dying in a brightly lit hallway, and no one was coming. Then, the world went silent. It wasn't the silence of being alone. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that precedes a lightning strike. The heavy steel door at the end of the corridor groaned open. The sound of Mark's breathing stopped. The pressure on my neck didn't vanish, but his fingers began to tremble. Click, click, click. The sound of leather soles hitting the floor was rhythmic and deliberate. It wasn't the frantic pace of a security guard or the casual stroll of a shopper. It was the walk of someone who owned the ground they stepped on. I looked past Mark's shoulder. A man stood there, silhouetted against the bright light of the main terminal. He was draped in a charcoal gray suit that looked like it cost more than everything I owned. His hair was perfectly slicked back, and his expression was as unreadable as a slab of granite. He didn't look angry. He looked bored, which was somehow much more terrifying. Behind him, two massive men in black suits stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind them. The exit sign flickered, casting a sickly red glow over the scene. "Let her go," the man said. His voice was a low, melodic baritone with a distinct Korean accent, smooth as silk and just as sharp. Mark didn't let go. Instead, he pulled me closer, using my body as a shield. "Mind your own business, pal. This is between me and my girl." The man in the gray suit sighed, a soft sound of genuine disappointment. He began to walk toward us, his eyes locked onto Mark's. As he moved, he reached up and began to slide a heavy gold signet ring off his right pinky finger. He tucked it into his vest pocket. Then he did the same with a band on his left hand. The ritual was chilling. He wasn't preparing to talk or negotiate. He was clearing his hands for work. "You are making a mess in a place where I like to shop," the man said, now only a few feet away. The air around him felt cold, vibrating with a level of violence that made Mark's domestic bullying look like a tantrum. And I find that incredibly disrespectful. Mark's grip finally faltered. The sudden shift in power was so absolute that the air seemed to return to the room all at once. As Mark's hand dropped from my throat, I slumped against the wall, gasping for air, my eyes never leaving the stranger who had just turned a predator into prey. The morning sun streamed through the glass atrium of the Grand Plaza Mall, casting long, cheerful diamonds of light across the polished marble floors. For the first time in 2 years, I didn't look over my shoulder as I walked through the sliding glass doors. I took a deep breath, and for once, the air didn't taste like anxiety. It tasted like expensive roasted coffee and new parchment. I spent the first hour doing things that used to be forbidden. I bought a vanilla latte with extra foam. Mark used to call it a waste of money, and sat by the fountain, watching the water dance. I wore a sundress the color of a bruised peach, a garment that had sat at the bottom of my closet for months because it was too eye-catching, according to him. Today, it felt like armor. Every click of my sandals on the floor was a tiny anthem of independence. Though the mall was a cathedral of normalcy, mothers pushed strollers, teenagers huddled together laughing over their phones, and elderly couples walked hand in hand. I felt invisible in the best way possible. To everyone else, I was just another shopper looking for a new pair of jeans or a birthday gift. They didn't see the faded yellow bruise on my ribs or the way my hands used to shake when a door slammed too hard. I was blending in, and that was the greatest gift I could ask for. I wandered into a bookstore, losing myself in the quiet hum of turning pages. I picked up a travel guide for Seoul, tracing the vibrant pictures of the Han River and the neon-lit streets of Gangnam. I had always wanted to travel, to see a world bigger than the four walls of our apartment. Mark had always told me I was too soft for the world, and that I'd get lost the moment I stepped outside his shadow. But as I stood there, the weight of the book solid in my hands, those words felt like a lie from a different lifetime. By noon, I was actually humming to myself. I stopped at a boutique to try on a pair of silver earrings. Looking in the mirror, I saw a girl whose eyes were finally starting to clear. The hollowing fear that usually sat behind my pupils had retreated. I felt light, almost buoyant, as if the heavy chains of the last few years had finally snapped. I bought the earrings, the crinkle of the shopping bag sounding like music. I decided to head toward the food court, thinking about what I wanted for lunch. I was making plans for the afternoon, maybe a movie or a walk in the park. The world felt wide and full of possibilities. I felt safe. I felt like the worst was behind me, and that I had finally outrun the ghost of the man who had tried to break me. I didn't notice the way the air seemed to chill as I passed the service hallway, or the dark reflection in the storefront window of a man following 20 paces behind, his eyes fixed on the back of my neck. I was too busy enjoying the sunshine, blissfully unaware that the safety I felt was nothing more than glass waiting to shatter. The humming stopped. It wasn't a sudden realization, but a slow, cold drip of intuition that started at the base of my spine and climbed upward. I was standing in front of a window display of silk scarves, but I wasn't looking at the fabric. I was looking at the reflection in the glass. A man was standing near a large potted palm 20 yards back. He was looking at his phone, but his body was angled toward me in a way that felt deliberate. When I moved to the next window, he moved. When I slowed down to look at a pair of shoes, he slowed down. My heart, which had been beating a steady, peaceful rhythm all morning, gave a sharp, painful thud against my ribs. I told myself I was being paranoid. Mark was miles away, probably at the bar or asleep in the apartment he had turned into my prison. I took a sharp right turn toward the department store, weaving through a circular rack of coats. I waited there, my breath hitching, peering through the gap between two wool sleeves. A few seconds later, he appeared. It wasn't Mark. Not yet. But a man I didn't recognize, wearing a nondescript baseball cap pulled low. He scanned the floor with a practiced, predatory sweep. He wasn't shopping. He was hunting. Panic, sharp and metallic, flooded my mouth. I ducked out of the clothing section and headed toward the main concourse. I needed people. I needed the safety of the crowds near the food court where the noise was loud enough to drown out a struggle. I walked faster, my shopping bags banging against my legs, the silver earrings I had just bought feeling like lead weights in my hand. I looked back again. The man in the cap was gone, but another man, taller, broader, was now walking parallel to me on the upper balcony. He wasn't even hiding it. He was looking straight down at me, his hand held to his ear as if he were speaking into a radio. The mall, which had felt like a sanctuary an hour ago, suddenly transformed into a labyrinth of dead ends and glass traps. The bright lights felt blinding, and the cheerful pop music over the speakers sounded like a mocking soundtrack to my fear. I saw the food court ahead, a sea of families and brightly colored plastic chairs. If I could just get there, I could find a security guard. I could disappear into the throng of people. I broke into a light jog, my sandals slapping against the marble. I was 30 feet away from the edge of the crowd when a familiar shape stepped out from behind a massive concrete pillar, blocking my path. The air left my lungs in a silent gasp. It was Mark. He was wearing the black hoodie I hated, his hands shoved deep into the front pocket. He wasn't yelling. He was smiling. That thin, razor-sharp smile that always preceded a storm. "Going somewhere, Hannah?" he asked, his voice casual and terrifyingly calm. I spun around to run back the way I came, but the man in the baseball cap and the man from the balcony were already there, closing the distance. They had funneled me away from the crowd, pushing me toward the dimly lit corridor that led to the service elevators and the loading docks. My sanctuary was gone. The shadows had finally caught up to the light. My breath came in shallow, jagged hitches as I backed away from the wall of men closing in on me. The cheerful noise of the food court just 30 feet away sounded like it was coming from another planet. Mark didn't rush. He moved with a slow, agonizing confidence, his eyes locked on mine with a look that said he had already won. He stepped into my personal space, and the familiar, suffocating scent of his wood smoke cologne filled my lungs, triggering 1,000 bad memories at once. I tried to dart to the left, toward the open mall area, but the man in the baseball cap stepped in my way, his massive frame blocking the light. With a rough shove, he redirected me toward the service corridor. I stumbled, my shopping bag spilling onto the floor. The silver earrings skittered across the marble, disappearing under a vending machine. I didn't care about them anymore. I only cared about the heavy steel door that was now looming behind me. "Please, Mark," I whispered, my voice cracking. "Just let me go. I haven't told anyone anything. I just want to live my life." He laughed, a dry, humorless sound that chilled me to the bone. "Your life? You don't have a life without me, Hannah. I made you. I'm the only reason you aren't rotting in some gutter." He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging into the muscle so hard I knew there would be a fresh set of bruises by morning. He yanked me into the service hallway, the heavy door groaning as it swung shut behind us, cutting off the last of the sunlight. The hallway was narrow, lined with gray cinderblock walls and flickering fluorescent tubes that hummed with a low, irritating buzz. Once we were out of sight of the cameras and the crowds, the mask of casual boyfriend dropped. His face contorted, his jaw tightening until the veins in his neck stood out. He threw me against the cold wall, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I tried to slide away, to find an exit, but he was faster. "You thought you were so clever, didn't you?" He spat, pinning me by my shoulders. "Buying new clothes, walking around like you're some independent woman. No, you're a joke." I found a spark of courage buried under the layers of terror. "I'm not a joke. I'm done with you." I swung my hand, aiming for his face, but he caught my wrist mid-air with terrifying ease. He twisted my arm back, forcing a cry of pain from my lips, and then his other hand flew up. His fingers clamped around my throat. The world tilted. The rough texture of the cinder block bit into the back of my head as he lifted me slightly off my heels. I kicked at his shins, my hands clawing desperately at his thick wrists, but it was like trying to move a mountain. My lungs burned, screaming for oxygen that wouldn't come. The red exit sign at the end of the hall began to blur, spinning into a dark, bloody smear in my vision. "I told you," Mark hissed, his face inches from mine, his eyes wide and manic. "If I can't have you, no one can. I'll end you right here, and no one will even hear you go." I looked at the heavy door we had just come through, praying for a janitor, a security guard, anyone. But there was only silence, and the sound of my own blood rushing in my ears. The darkness started to crawl in from the corners of my eyes, and for a terrifying second, I accepted that this was how it ended. I was going to be a headline in tomorrow's paper. Then, through the haze of my fading consciousness, I heard it. A heavy, metallic thud from the end of the hallway. The sound of a door being opened not with a plea, but with authority. The heavy steel door at the far end of the service corridor didn't just open. It swung back with a slow, deliberate weight that made the air in the narrow hallway shift. The sound of the latch clicking against the wall was like a gunshot in the cramped space. Mark didn't let go of my throat immediately, but his grip faltered, his head snapping toward the intrusion. I slumped against the cinder blocks, my lungs drawing in a jagged, burning sliver of oxygen as a figure stepped out of the shadows of the doorway. He wasn't a mall security guard in a cheap polyester uniform. He was a man who looked like he had stepped out of a high-end fashion magazine and into a nightmare. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit him with surgical precision, his white shirt crisp and blinding under the flickering fluorescent lights. He didn't say a word. He didn't yell for Mark to stop, and he didn't reach for a phone to call the police. He simply walked toward us. The sound of his polished Oxfords on the concrete was rhythmic. Tap, 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 carrying a terrifying steady pace that suggested he wasn't worried about what he was walking into. Behind him, two other men followed, their shoulders broad enough to fill the width of the hallway. They were shadows to his flame, their faces devoid of emotion, their eyes scanning the room with a cold, professional hunger. Mark tightened his grip on my arm, his voice shaking as he tried to regain his bravado. "Get lost. This doesn't involve you." The man in the gray suit stopped exactly 6 feet away. He was older than Mark, with sharp, angular features and dark eyes that seemed to absorb all the light in the hallway. He didn't look at Mark's face. He looked at the hand Mark still had wrapped around my bicep, then at the red marks darkening the skin of my throat. His silence was heavier than any shout could have been. It was a suffocating physical presence that made the air feel thin. Mark's two friends, the ones who had helped corner me, stepped forward to intervene. They were big men, used to intimidating people in bars and back alleys. But as they moved toward the man in the suit, the two silent giants behind him stepped out. There was no fight, only a brief, blurred motion. Within seconds, Mark's friends were pinned against the opposite wall, their arms twisted behind them in a way that looked agonizing. They didn't make a sound. They looked too terrified to breathe. The man in the suit finally looked up, his gaze meeting Mark's. He had a stillness about him that was unnatural, the kind of calm found at the center of a hurricane. He didn't seem angry. He looked like a man observing a particularly disgusting insect that had crawled onto his dinner plate. "You are making a great deal of noise," the man said. His voice was a low, smooth baritone, his English perfect, but carrying a melodic, dangerous edge. He spoke quietly, forcing Mark to lean in just to hear him. "I was having a very peaceful afternoon until I heard the sound of a coward screaming at a woman." Mark tried to pull me back, but his legs seemed to have turned to lead. "You don't know who I am," Mark hissed, though the tremor in his hands gave him away. The stranger didn't blink. He just stared, his dark eyes boring into Mark's soul until the bullying light in my ex-boyfriend's eyes began to flicker and die. The man's silence commanded the entire corridor, turning the service hallway into his personal courtroom. I watched, breathless, as the man reached up and slowly began to unbutton his suit jacket, his movements fluid and calm, as if he were preparing for a casual conversation rather than a violent confrontation. The hallway felt like it was losing oxygen, but not because of Mark's hand. It was the man in the charcoal suit. He stood there, perfectly still, radiating a cold authority that made the air feel heavy. Mark was still holding my arm, but his grip was no longer firm. It was the desperate, twitching clutch of a man who realized he had stepped into a trap he couldn't see. The stranger didn't rush him. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he slowly raised his right hand. His fingers were long and elegant, looking more like those of a pianist than a fighter. On his pinky finger sat a heavy gold signet ring, etched with a crest that caught the flickering light of the hallway. With a slow, rhythmic motion, he twisted the ring. The metal grated softly against his skin, the only sound in the suffocating silence. He pulled the ring off and held it up for a moment, letting the gold shimmer before dropping it into the breast pocket of his jacket. Then he moved to his left hand. A thick platinum band sat on his ring finger. He slid that one off too, his movements methodical and calm, like a doctor prepping for surgery. The ritual was terrifying. It was a clear, unspoken signal that he was preparing to use his hands, and he didn't want anything, not even jewelry, to get in the way of the damage he was about to inflict. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was a professional clearing the workspace. "The girl," the man said, his voice a low, melodic hum that vibrated in the small space. "Let her go." Mark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He tried to puff out his chest, to regain the dominance he had used to terrorize me for years. "I told you to back off. This is none of your business. She's my—" "I am not going to ask you a second time," the man interrupted. He didn't raise his voice, but the edge in his tone was sharp enough to draw blood. He took a single step forward. The two giants behind him shifted in unison, their shadows lengthening across the concrete floor. "I am giving you a gift right now, a single chance to walk away with your hands still functioning. If you do not release her by the time I take my next step, that gift is retracted." I looked at Mark. His face was pale, beads of sweat breaking out along his hairline. He looked down at me. He then back at the man in the suit. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the room felt tilted. For the first time since I had met him, I saw Mark truly afraid. He wasn't the monster anymore. He was just a small, mean man standing in the path of a tidal wave. The stranger's dark eyes never left Mark's. He began to shift his weight, his polished shoe hovering just an inch above the floor, ready to take that final decisive step. The silence in the hallway was absolute, a ticking clock that only the two of them could hear. "Last chance," the man whispered. Mark's fingers trembled against my skin. He looked at the man's bare hands, the hands that were now free of rings and ready for violence, and his bravado finally shattered. Mark's hand finally snapped away from my arm as if my skin had turned into red-hot iron. He took a staggering step back, his face a pale, sweating mess of indecision. He looked at his friends, but they were still pinned like specimens against the wall by the two giants in black. He was alone, and for the first time the tough guy persona he had used to rule my life was starting to fray at the edges. "You think you're something special because you have a suit?" Mark spat, though his voice cracked at the end. He pulled a small folding pocket knife from his hoodie, the one he used to use to intimidate me during dinner arguments. He flicked it open, the cheap blade clicking into place. "Stay back, old man, I'm not playing." The man in the charcoal suit didn't flinch. He didn't even change his stance. A small, chilling smile played at the corners of his mouth, not a smile of amusement, but the cold satisfaction of a hunter watching a trapped animal make a fatal mistake. "Old man," the stranger repeated softly, the words tasting like ice. Mark lunged. It was a clumsy, desperate move, fueled by the kind of amateur rage that usually worked on people like me. But against the man in the suit, it looked like a movie playing in slow motion. The stranger moved with a terrifying, liquid grace. He didn't jump back. He stepped into Mark's space, his body pivoting with the precision of a clockwork machine. With one hand, the stranger caught Mark's wrist. There was a sickening, dry crack that echoed off the cinderblock walls. Mark's scream was cut short as the stranger's other hand struck him. Not a wild punch, but a series of short, brutal strikes to the throat and solar plexus. The knife clattered to the floor, forgotten. Gone in less than 3 seconds, Mark was on his knees. The man in the suit didn't stop there. He grabbed Mark by the back of his hair, forcing his head up so they were eye to eye. Mark's nose was bleeding, and his eyes were wide with a type of terror I had never seen before. This wasn't the fear of getting caught. It was the fear of a man who realized he was no longer at the top of the food chain. As I watched from the floor, gasping for air, the realization hit me like a physical blow. Mark was a bully. He relied on noise, size, and the weakness of those he could hurt. He was a loud, messy creature that fed on intimidation. But the man holding him? He was a predator. There was no noise in his violence. There was no ego. He was efficient, silent, and absolute. He didn't need to shout because he knew exactly how much force it took to break a human being. The stranger leaned in close to Mark's ear, his voice still that same terrifyingly calm baritone. You made the mistake of thinking your loud voice made you powerful. It only made you a nuisance. He released Mark's hair, and my ex-boyfriend slumped into a heap on the concrete, gasping and clutching his broken wrist. The stranger didn't even look down at the man he had just dismantled. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket, wiped a single drop of Mark's blood from his knuckle, and let the cloth fall onto Mark's face like a shroud. The two giants released Mark's friends, who immediately scrambled toward the exit, not even looking back at their leader. The hallway was quiet again, except for the sound of my own shaking breath. I looked at the stranger, and for the first time, he turned his gaze toward me. It wasn't the gaze of a hero. It was the look of someone who had seen everything and feared nothing. The man in the charcoal suit gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Without a word of instruction, the two giants stepped forward. They didn't help Mark up. They grabbed him by the collar of his hoodie and the waistband of his jeans, lifting him off the floor like a bag of trash. Mark tried to moan, a weak, gurgling sound coming from his throat, but one of the men tightened a grip on a pressure point, and Mark went limp with fear. They dragged him toward the service elevators, his heels scuffing uselessly against the concrete. The heavy doors slid open with a metallic groan, swallowed the three of them, and closed again. The silence that followed was even more deafening than the struggle. I was still sitting on the floor, my back pressed against the cold cinder blocks. My legs felt like water, and the marks on my neck were beginning to throb with a dull, rhythmic heat. I looked up at the man who remained. He stood in the center of the hallway, perfectly composed, as if he hadn't just broken a man's wrist and spirit in the span of a heartbeat. He reached into his vest pocket, pulled out the gold signet ring, and slid it back onto his pinky. Then came the platinum band. The ritual was complete. The work was over, and the businessman had returned. "You can stand up now," he said. It wasn't a suggestion, it was an observation. I scrambled to my feet, using the wall for support. My shopping bags were torn, my new clothes scattered, and the silver earrings were lost somewhere in the dark. I felt exposed and small under his gaze. He didn't look at me with pity. I had seen enough pity from social workers and well-meaning friends to last a lifetime. He looked at me with a terrifying, clinical interest. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and raspy. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't walked through that door." "I do," he replied simply. He stepped closer, and I instinctively stiffened, but he stopped at a respectful distance. He would have finished what he started. Men like that do not stop until they are made to stop. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, thick card. It was matte black with nothing but a gold-embossed phone number on the front. No name, no title, no address. He held it out between two fingers. I hesitated. I had spent years trying to escape the control of one dangerous man. Taking this card felt like stepping out of a shallow pond and into a deep, dark ocean. I could feel the weight of the moment, the invisible thread of a debt being spun between us. In his world, people didn't do favors for free. "Why did you help me?" I asked, my hand trembling as I reached for the card. "I dislike messy things," he said, his dark eyes fixed on mine. "And I dislike people who think they can claim ownership over something that does not belong to them." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "You are free of him now, Hannah. My men will ensure he never finds his way back to your door. But free is a relative term." I took the card. The edges were sharp, and the paper was heavy. As my fingers brushed his, a spark of pure, cold electricity seemed to jump between us. He didn't pull away. He simply watched me realize that I hadn't just been saved. I had been noticed. "Go home," he said softly. Ice your throat. Wear your new clothes. If he, or anyone else, ever makes the mistake of touching you again, you have the number. He turned on his heel, his charcoal suit catching the dim light as he walked back toward the main mall entrance. He didn't look back. I stood alone in the hallway, clutching the black card to my chest, realizing that while the ghost of my past was gone, a much more powerful shadow had just taken its place. I started to turn toward the exit, my fingers still white-knuckled around the black card, but the man stopped. He didn't turn around, but his voice drifted back to me, stopping me in my tracks. You should know, Hana, that I didn't just happen to hear a noise in a hallway. He turned slowly, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. The overhead lights flickered once, casting a shadow across his sharp cheekbones. There was a strange look in his eyes. Not malice, but something more like the cold satisfaction of a collector who had finally acquired a missing piece. I've seen him follow you for the last 3 blocks, he said, his voice as calm as a still lake. I watched him wait outside the bookstore while you looked at guides for a city you've never seen. I saw him track you through the boutique while you picked out those silver earrings. He was a very loud shadow, and I find loud things irritating. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning ran down my spine. The idea that Mark had been stalking me was terrifying, but the realization that this man had been stalking the stalker was something else entirely. I wasn't just a girl who got lucky. I was a girl who had been under a microscope. You were watching me? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Why? Because you were trying very hard to be brave, he said, taking a step back toward me. And because I wanted to see if he would actually be stupid enough to cross into my territory. This mall is a place of business. My business. He brought his filth into a clean house. He stopped just a few feet away, his presence looming over me like a mountain. He didn't look like a savior anymore. He looked like an architect who was redesigning my life without asking for my permission. Mark is a small man with a long memory, he continued. If he survives the night, so he will spend his life nursing his broken wrist and his bruised ego. He will wait until the fear fades, and then he will come for you again. Men like him are like weeds. You can cut them down, but unless you pull them out by the root, they always return. I looked down at the black card in my hand. Then what am I supposed to do? I can't keep running forever. You don't have to run, he said. He leaned in slightly, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something human in his gaze, a dark, ancient understanding of the world's cruelty. I can make him disappear, not just from this mall, but from your world. I can ensure that his name is never spoken in your presence again, and that he never draws breath in a city where you reside. I felt the weight of his offer. It wasn't a gift, it was a pact. He was offering to be the permanent solution to my problem, but I knew that kind of safety came with a price tag that wasn't measured in money. To have a wolf protect you, you have to let the wolf into your home. And what would you want in return? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Loyalty, he said simply. I find that I am in need of someone with your resilience, someone who knows how to survive in the dark but still looks for the light. Think about it, Hana. You can go back to a life of looking over your shoulder, or you can step behind the curtain where the shadows work for you. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned back toward the exit, his long coat swishing against his legs. I stood there in the dim light of the service hallway. The black card felt heavy, as if it were made of lead. He had given me a choice between the monster I knew and the god I didn't. I walked out of the service corridor and back into the main atrium of the mall, but the world didn't look the same as it had 2 hours ago. The bright lights that had once seemed cheerful now felt like a stage production, a thin layer of glitter over a much darker reality. My throat was tight, and the skin was beginning to darken into a deep purple bruise, but the pain felt distant, eclipsed by the weight of the black card pressed against my palm. I passed a trash can and hesitated for a fraction of a second, my hand hovering over the rim. I could drop the card. I could walk out those glass doors, call the police, and try to play by the rules of the world I used to live in. But I knew what that world looked like for people like me. It was a world of restraining orders that were just pieces of paper and, "I'm sorry," letters from a man who would eventually find his way back to my door. I shoved the card deep into my pocket. The mall was closing. The upbeat music had stopped, replaced by the low, steady hum of the industrial floor buffers. Most of the shoppers were gone, leaving only the ghosts of the day behind. I walked past the boutique where I had bought the earrings. The display was still there, but the girl in the reflection wasn't the same one who had been humming to herself at noon. Her shoulders were set lower, her gaze sharper. She looked like someone who had just seen the gears behind the clock. When I reached the sliding glass doors, I didn't hesitate. I stepped out into the cool evening air. The parking lot was a sea of gray asphalt and orange streetlights. And in the distance, I saw a black sedan idling near the exit. It wasn't Mark's car. It was sleek, silent, and tinted so dark it looked like a hole in the universe. It didn't move toward me, but I knew it was there. I knew they were all there. I realized then that the safety the man in the charcoal suit had offered wasn't the kind of safety you find in a locked room. It was the safety of the predator. Mark was gone, removed like a stain from a silk tie, but I hadn't truly escaped. I had simply moved from a small chaotic cage into a massive gilded territory. I started my car and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, watching the black sedan pull away and vanish into the city traffic. I touched the bruise on my neck, tracing the shape of the violence that had almost ended me. For the first time in years, the fear was gone, but in its place was a cold, buzzing electricity. I put the car in gear and drove toward the city lights. My past was a smoking ruin behind me, neutralized by a man who didn't believe in mercy. Ahead of me lay a world of sharp suits, silent hallways, and debts that never truly got paid off. It was a dangerous world, a complex world, and a world where I finally had a voice, even if that voice was now tied to a gold-embossed phone number. I wasn't just Hannah anymore. I was someone who had been chosen. As I merged onto the highway, I took the card out and placed it on the dashboard. I didn't know where this road led, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being hunted. I was the one with the map,